Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here, as always, with John, my friend and co-host. John, how are you doing?
Very well, Dan. Nice to be here and always excited to be on the International Schools podcast. It's been a while since we've been together, Dan.
Yeah, I know we had some time off in the summer, and now it's kind of the busy time for both of us at the start of the school year.
Yeah. And one thing about a year ago, an organization called earthday.org, a lovely lady called Sarah reached out to me and said, I listened to your podcast. You've never done anything on the environment or, sustainability. And I was just thinking, wow, good point. We have it. And it's interesting because, Dan, I don't know, you spent time in Austria, but this summer in Switzerland, it was the worst year of environmental challenges we've had in decades. We had multiple valleys where rock slides basically isolated villages. The town that my family's from, Brience, was shut down from mudslides. We've had multiple people die. We've had floods outside of Lake Léman, where whole industries have been shut down. This year has really been a year in Switzerland where you are starting to hear many more conversations. Is it sustainable to have communities up in these isolated areas with the rain and the glaciers melting? It was just so much about the environment that I've never had in my own context.
Yeah,
I
very
don't know
interesting.
if in Austria you had the same situation.
Yeah, a few things, but nothing as extreme that I heard about. But yeah, I mean, people definitely we know they were definitely talking about the record heat in the summer, in the middle of the summer, and things like that.
Yeah. So we're really excited to have Emily, Bryce, and Dennis. Uh, Emily is the education coordinator at earthday.org, and Dennis is the education coordinator also at earthday.org, and Bryce is a director of education, earthday.org. And we just thought, what a great opportunity, because I think one of the things that I was talking before we start recording, it's challenging to engage kids on this topic because we tend to go doomsday. Oh, the world's going to burn up. It's all your responsibility. And they're looking at us like, time out. Wait. There's 100 years of bad environmental sustainability. And now you're saying it's our responsibility. I'm being facetious, but I think this is definitely a challenge. How do we engage not only educators in the international sphere, but school leaders, but the students, where they don't feel it's all a disaster and doom and gloom? Because the statistics and what is being pushed out through social media and the media often is not very positive. And so Emily, Bryce, and Dennis today are going to guide us through some of the thinking and some of the work that they do. And I want to remind our audience, go to the show notes. They've done a phenomenal job of sharing resources. And it's an organization you have to definitely connect with because the work they do is phenomenal. And I think their approach is far more less doomsday. It's about how do we build capacity? How do we empower kids not to feel stressed and about this existential threat, but how can we concretely do things that can connect with kids and teachers? So it's a real privilege to have all three of you here. And I'm just going to kick off, if I can, with kind of the first thing. And Bryce, maybe you can tell us a bit about Earth Day, because a lot of people might be familiar with the event, but more the organization, your philosophy, and how you position yourselves in the education world.
Of course. Thank you, Dan and John, for inviting us on your program and for that lovely introduction. And yeah, when I think about Earth Day, I think about what you were saying in your organization about, or in your introduction about how do we look at the positives and how do we mobilize for action? And that's really what came out of the first Earth Day. So in 1970, mobilizing teach-ins around universities for the environment and environmental issues of the time, and then building on that into a movement about what can we do for the environment. And now it's something that an estimated billion people every year are exposed to Earth Day, through their schools, through their communities, through messaging. And one of the ways that our organization has done that successfully is by organizing these actions around a theme. So it gives people, each year a purpose and a way to focus on the environment. So last year it was planet versus plastics. So you have schools and you have organizations thinking and individuals thinking, okay, how can I take actions with this very specific topic with plastics? And individual schools, businesses, they all have their own way to do that successfully. This year we're looking at our power consumption, and we're looking at our power, our planet, and promoting renewables. So I think it's really about, since 1970, activating individuals and looking for ways that they can contribute to their, within their homes or within their communities.
I really like this idea of focusing on one topic because it makes it manageable. Because sometimes when you have the environment and climate change, it just seems so massive. And, beelining on plastics, that's something really concrete. I know that in one of the schools that I was, when that was taking place, we basically said no more plastic bottles at school. And the cafeteria no more had plastic bottles. So it was something very tangible and very actionable, and there was quick results. And I really like that approach that you have, Bryce, with really focusing on something smaller or on something one topic, because I think so often kids and adults, I think we just struggle with just the immensity of it.
Yeah, and it's something that people get excited about every year. I was really, I'm surprised how many people reached out, teachers reached out, businesses. They said, when are you going to release your theme? Because we want to start planning what our display is going to look like or how we can engage with our students on that topic.
What are some of the past themes you've had, Bryce? What other ones have you done?
So like I said, last year was planet versus plastics,
Yep.
which was, how are we going to, looking at microplastics and releasing reports around that. Previous to that was invest in our planet. So looking at ways that we can, use investment, use capital, use our own investments to, create positive growth in the environment.
Okay.
Nice. So, of course, you, Emily, Bryce, and Dennis, you're working for this organization. Dennis, what is your own personal journey? Are you guys all people that have had this aha moment about the environment, and then you knocked on the door on Earth Day and say, hey, I want to help you. What can I do? And do you think often that's what's happening with a lot of these organizations? Because you're not the only one, but it's actually becomes a personal journey that then turns into a professional journey.
Yeah, very much so. So once again, thank you for having us on here. My personal journey actually happened in 2020. I was a eighth grade English teacher in California, and as many of you might know, there are these wildfires that were prevalent all over California, and so we had smoke days where students couldn't go outside because of the smoke. And I was teaching, my regular lessons, teaching books, and the students all they could talk about was the smoke. And so I decided to modify one of my units so that it would be focused on climate change. And so I brought in all these articles, current events, the students researched about climate change in California. And it was really powerful. At the end of the unit, a lot of the students said that this was the most powerful unit that they've had, not just in English, but in their entire scholastic career so far. And that really touched me. And again, I was teaching 100 to 150 students, and I thought, I was able to do this, introduce these topics of climate change to these students, 150 of them. Why not go to an organization like Earth Day that has a global reach? And so that's kind of been my journey as to how I got interested in climate education.
Thank you, Dennis. Emily, I'm curious if you can share your journey too.
Yeah, similar to Dennis, I did have a cumulative kind of event. I was previously an elementary school teacher, and I was just noticing among my students a lot of disconnect from nature. A lot of them really, didn't really go outside. There wasn't a whole lot of talk about the environment, except for kind of on Earth Days where I was able to kind of really do a project, have, something to do around Earth Day. And kids loved it. They loved how engaging it was. It was usually a fun project. And that's where I found kind of my own agency as a teacher to really expose students to, nature. But a couple years ago in my classroom, we had the smoke from the California wildfires. Being in Virginia was kind of interesting to see how it came down through the wind. And, we had a week of where the students couldn't go outside and play on the playground. And, 5 and 6 year olds, they have tons of energy. They need to be able to run around and get their energy out, but we couldn't go outside. And I just noticed, the students, they just, they wanted to go outside. They wanted to, they were curious on like why the sky looked kind of hazy and why there was this, smell in the air. And so we had to talk about it, and it kind of led to more discussions about, kind of just like what's going on in the world and how, things elsewhere affect us here, and how it affects our local community. So that was kind of one of the biggest moments for me as a teacher, where climate change really impacted my students. And that kind of led me to Earth Day, to kind of create change and more bring awareness, especially for the disconnect of nature, to students all over the world.
Wonderful. So it's interesting how both of you have, you lived some event and that event changed you. And I think often that's the case. If you often read about activists and environmentalists, it's something that really hits you at home. I know that this summer, and especially the hometown where my family originally comes from, that really impacted us as a family. We're like, damn, our family's been there since the 1590s, and suddenly this is happening, and it just really kind of hit home. Emily, many of the children and students and teachers that work in international schools fly. They have quite a big carbon footprint, sometimes not out of desire, but just the logistics of going back to their home country, going back for holidays. And I'm wondering, how do you think schools can balance this carbon footprint while positioning themselves with sustainability? How do you play both?
I think a big part of it is how can we kind of streamline certain like transportation. I think, public transportation is really important. Advocating for public transit, carpooling, using buses. Those are all really important as far as, our carbon footprint. Things that we really don't think of, especially also with schools. School buildings aren't as efficient as they should be. And that's kind of aligns very well with our theme this year on renewable energy. How can we make schools more energy efficient, reduce carbon footprint by, adding solar panels to the roof of schools? How can we, utilize infrastructure to kind of teach students about kind of renewable energies and kind of just bring it local. I think when students see their school changes, if their school is adapting these solar panels, they can be part of the conversation. They see, the change happening in real time and being sustainable. And I think that, really resonates with students when they get to see it, with their own eyes and be part of the experience.
And can I just add something to that? Yeah, that was a great answer, Emily. And I think what Emily touched on is using the space that's already there for the schools by, putting solar panels, even like a wind turbine there, so that when students start seeing it as they grow up later on in life, it's not this unfamiliar sight. Seeing a field of solar panels or a wind turbine, it becomes normal and natural. And that's one of the things that we promote at Earth Day, is preparing students for the green economy. And actually, one of the things I love to tell people is the fastest growing job, at least in the United States, over the next decade is wind turbine technician. And so exposing students early on to this kind of renewable technology, it makes it so it's not scary or brand new to them. They're already familiar with these things. So then when they're adults, they can say, oh, maybe I can become a wind turbine technician or solar panel installationist or any number of green jobs.
I'm just curious about, talking about the carbon footprint of schools and things. Like, I would imagine anecdotally that if you take the Western countries, the US, I would imagine it would be the worst. I mean, you stuff you see in America, which to us, like if you live in a European city, I would say, John, I would say the majority of students would travel by public transport to school. In an international school that's outside the city, but one that's in a city, almost everyone would. Whereas in America, it's like, I mean, like the students will drive to school, which to me is crazy because in the school I went to, I'm sure it's still the same. There was no option for students to park their car at the school. Not that anyone had a car, but you wouldn't be able to do it. Whereas in the US, it's normal for hundreds, if not thousands, of students to drive into school. Like, is the US the worst, or do you have curiosity if you know anything about that? I'm just thinking anecdotally about which countries are the worst, environmental school culprits.
Bryce?
Yeah, personally, I don't have the data on that, but I think that's a really interesting point, Dan, and something that definitely, when we think of system changing or trying to change attitudes, is so critical, because that is, my experience, in American high school is that, if you could avoid riding the school bus, you did, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a little bit of a, you turn 16 and you get a car and you drive that to school every day. So yeah, how do we change that? How do we, how do we make buses cool? And I think
schools, why don't schools just say, look, students can't drive. No students can park their car in school. You have to get public transport. That would have been easy. I guess maybe rural areas and things, that could be a problem, but I think in most cities, there we've worked out a solution already. Ban cars for schools.
Bryce, you wanted to also add, and thank you. I really agree with both of you, and I think that's what Dan was alluding to too, is that if we can make something real within the context of the building or the environment that kids see. And I know, Bryce, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's important, that we find ways to get students to see the real impacts of their behavior. So, thinking about something like our theme, how can, we just launched our theme for renewable energies, and I think, we'll see what teachers come up with, what businesses come up with, but I'm sure they'll come up with fascinating projects. But, that's what we saw with plastics. How can students see the results of their actions and be motivated by that?
So one thing is that, you want to get students engaged. I think that's really important, and teachers too. But, how can you really, what are some specific actions that you've seen that schools and students and teachers have done that they're focusing on the positive change more than kind of this guilt complex? Oh, we need to do something because if we don't, we look bad.
That's a topic I'm really interested in. Maybe if I could talk about that more generally real quick, and maybe Emily, if you could talk about some of the specific examples. But, I think it's really, if you look back at, when I was in high school and we were talking about global warming, and we were talking about calculating your carbon footprint, and there was a lot of this responsibility on the individual and guilt, and that kind of turned people away from the environmental movement. But then you saw, a big swing away from talking about individual responsibility, and that being kind of wrapped up in blaming. And what I'm starting to see now, what we've been talking about, and we should mention that the World Bank just came out with an outstanding climate education report filled with tons of data, including data about how individual action leads to positive environmental changes, leads to decreases in carbon emissions. So I think we need to, of course, we don't want to blame individuals. So it's this fine line that we need to walk. But it's such a missed opportunity to pretend like individuals collectively, we can't have a change in our environment. And especially we think of young people and all the decisions that they're going to make, career decisions, and the network effects that we have, that these young people go home and they learn about their theme at school, and then they go home and they talk to their parents about it. And, that's very powerful. So, I just want to talk generally about how I'm seeing in the data this shift that, let's not forget about the power of individuals. And I think, we're seeing that in schools as well.
I think that's important because often kids will say, well, it doesn't make a difference if I save a plastic bottle or if I pick up a piece of paper, whatever it might be. They don't see in the bigger thing what that looks like. So I think your point's an interesting one, that there's that data that actually backs that up. Emily, and then Dennis.
Yeah, I think when we look at, how we're teaching students and how we talk about climate change is important. I think going foundationally back to social emotional learning. How do we equip students with problem solving, critical thinking skills? The agency, self-efficacy, those are all very important things that we have to teach students. We have to model that for them so they have that sense of power and agency that's so important when we're looking at climate solutions. So I think we really have to kind of focus on those skills to kind of tackle everything that comes at them, building resiliency. And I think we're seeing the connection between social emotional learning and climate change and how it's a powerful tool when we're talking about climate education and interweaving it into the conversations and topics on climate.
And I like that connection between social emotional and the critical thinking and climate change. That's really interesting. Thank you, Emily. Dennis?
Yeah, I just want to touch on one thing that Bryce mentioned about the network effect. So one of the really fascinating things about climate education is in India, they did a study, and this is in the World Bank report that Bryce mentioned, that when students were exposed to climate education lessons, they had increased pro-climate behaviors. So, recycling and all that. But the even added bonus was that parents had a 13% increase in pro-climate behaviors. So it goes to show there that once the students are learning about climate education, how to be more sustainable, and they bring that information home, the parents take on that information. They're more likely to internalize it and see it as something that is positive. So again, just like Bryce was saying, the network effect can be so powerful.
That's so interesting. Do you think that Greta Thunberg is an example of that at a large scale?
I think she. Oh, sorry, Bryce. Were you going to mention something?
Oh no, I just was remembering a statistic specifically about that, which was they did a survey in Switzerland after the Fridays for Future movement, and they found that 30% of adults in Switzerland said that they had changed their behaviors in some way as a result of the Fridays for Future. So, that.
Can you tell us about the Friday for Futures for people that might not be familiar?
Yeah, so the movement with Greta Thunberg started by protesting on Fridays and saying essentially, I'm going to not go to school today. I'm going to go to my, local elected officials or whatever government building and raise awareness for the environment. And it grew as a movement worldwide. And as I said, it had, this study was just Switzerland, and it had, it's millions of people in one country. It wasn't a worldwide study, but we had millions of people in one country who said that they changed their behavior. So, some of the stuff, it's hard to collect the full impact. It's hard to know, but if you could, it would be outstanding.
Yeah, and that's and I didn't even know. I live in Switzerland, so this is great. I'm going to look that up. That's awesome. Dennis, about the Greta Thunberg, tell me a bit your thoughts, because I think, she's kind of, I know when in classroom situations, when you do videos of her, kids really resonate. She really kids see her and she speaks their language, and more than, some other people. What is your thought? Do you think that has been impactful?
Oh, definitely. And it's interesting that you bring up Greta, because she was one. I showed my classroom when I was a eighth grade English teacher, one of her videos, and it really resonated with my students. I mean, here they see this young girl who is just very passionate about the environment, and she was protesting and doing all these things to help the environment. And so they got, inspired. And that's really the amazing thing about Greta, is she was able to inspire people. And she inspired my classroom to go do a beach cleanup. So that was one of the culminating projects of my climate education unit that I did. We ended up doing a beach cleanup in Los Angeles. And again, I think she's an inspiration, Greta.
Absolutely. So, if we think of audience members here who are classroom teachers and they want to kind of make that connection between local and global impact, what are some strategies that you as an organization have seen to work, or if you have any tips or thoughts for people to say, oh, this is what we've seen? I don't know. Dennis, do you want to start? And then we'll go to Emily and Bryce.
Yeah, no, definitely connecting to the local issues. I think that's always a strong way to start. A lot of times, students live in their kind of own little bubble. That's all they know. Their kind of hometown, and so by connecting climate change to a local issue, whether it be drought or wildfires, whatever it may be, it's the impact is a lot more concrete. And so I think that is one way to start. But then also showing on a global scale, just like Emily mentioned, the Canadian wildfires were off in another country, but they were still affecting her students who were thousands of miles away. And so kind of making that connection from local to global is really important.
Emily?
Yeah, I think, what Dennis said was perfect example of how you have to bring local or global to local. I think we need to kind of focus on problem solving and project-based learning. I think that's a great way for students to go through the steps of, tackling a climate issue. So by taking something that's happening in their local community, whether it's deforestation or maybe they're having, extreme heat, and kind of looking at it and asking a question and how can we solve this problem? So walking students through project or problem-based learning examples, I think is really important for students to kind of walk through the steps and kind of see real world solutions to like a local issue, which makes it very authentic.
Bryce? Thank you, Emily.
I think tying it to individuals like Dennis and Emily were saying, and whether that's in your community, businesses, could be farmers, could be it could be anyone who's being impacted by the climate crisis in your community, and you might have to look outside your community in some cases as well. And I think that you need to have that individual approach to really make the connection with young people. Personally, I grew up in a northern state in the United States, in Michigan, which is surrounded by the Great Lakes. So I remember when I was 13 learning about global warming, it was like, well, this state is really cold and we're surrounded by there's no water scarcity here, and we're pretty protected from climate disasters. And, I don't like to admit that now, but I can also forgive myself for that because I was a child at the time. And it's understandable that I would be looking at a problem from my bias, from my perspective. And I think that's why climate education is so important, that adults, that the teachers are providing young people with what these individual examples look like. Because, I didn't have this, but if I had a teacher say, okay, that is the reality here. And, we might have climate refugees. That might be one of our, impacts. Like, let's think about that. But, learning about, especially in, developing countries, if you look at the climate disasters that India has been struck with, I think that would have shaped my worldview on this at a younger age.
When you talk about this connection with individuals, and Emily was talking about the problem solving, really problem solving and making those connections. What are you seeing when you talk to teachers and education, or what are the challenges? What kind of pushback do you get? Because obviously, what you're proposing is very sound. It makes sense. But often teachers are busy, or there's too much going on, or there's pushback. What are kind of some of the things that you're being challenged by as an organization to get people to engage at this level of, local, global, individual, and kind of this attitude of let's really think about it as problem solving? And I'll let whoever wants to share, and then we'll go around.
Yeah, I can just start off by saying that educators want to teach climate change. 87% of educators say that they would like to incorporate it in some way into their classroom. Now, I think the two biggest issues, it's time. I think teachers, and being a former educator myself, there's not enough time to do all of the standards. I mean, teachers are given a just laundry list of things that they have to tackle throughout the entire year. So I think time is a big issue. And actually, right now, most students only get about 2 hours of climate education per year currently. And it should definitely be a lot more. And a lot of times it falls just on the science teacher. And at Earth Day, we would definitely advocate for comprehensive interdisciplinary climate education. So it shouldn't just be taught in the science classroom. It should be incorporated in the English classroom, music, art, because it's applicable everywhere. The other thing too is that less than 50% of educators have said that they've received formal training on climate education and sustainability. And so that's one of the biggest issues, is that they're not getting the training necessary for that. One of the ways that we've tried to remedy this is we've created our own teacher training guide. So we've created the school guide to climate education. And so that just came out this past month in August. And it's training teachers on how to embed climate education into the lessons that they already have. So it kind of solves that time issue as well. It's not going to be this component that you add on top of everything that you already have. It's going to be woven into a lesson that you already have. So those are probably the two issues that I see facing educators right now, trying to incorporate climate education.
I think it's so interesting you're bringing up that idea of the resource where people can embed in what they're already doing. It's much easier to convince an educator, actually, it's not going to be an added on, or it's going to fill up that plate even more that's overflowing. And I think that's really quite powerful way to go about that. That sounds really good. And of course, I'll tell people go to the show notes because those resources are available. Emily and then Bryce.
Yeah, I can kind of expand on what Dennis mentioned about professional development. I think teachers want to know how to incorporate climate change topics into their curriculum, but a lot of times it's not there, or if it is, they don't really know how to go about it. I also think it's about kind of how we're framing it. And I think, a holistic approach is very critical here. But being former teachers, professional development is something all teachers have to go through. Why not put climate education into institutional professional development, where, it checks off the box for more than one thing. Teachers love that. And it's kind of framing it inside the school. So it makes sense. So all teachers are learning it at the same time. So they can, collaborate, communicate if, they have ideas, they're sharing. So I think it becomes very collaborative. And I think that's also really important here, relating it to students' needs. And it's able to kind of bring in this differentiation for climate change topics that is really important to make it more authentic for students. I think authenticity here is kind of one of the key factors and things we need to focus on to make it relevant.
Yeah, and I think your point's so true. The more authentic it is and kids can make that intrinsic connection, I think it becomes more powerful and it makes sense to them, right? It's something that they have ownership with. Bryce?
Yeah, I was talking with someone yesterday about the statistic that Dennis shared a bit ago, that in the United States, at least, that students are receiving, 1 to 2 hours of climate education a year. And, I was joking, like, you could call in sick for like 2 days. You could miss 2 days and just miss the climate crisis. Like that is not okay. It's such a pressing issue. And so, we are kind of approaching that with two different, we have two different approaches. And one is something like the School's Guide to Climate Education, which is if you're teaching a lesson, I used to teach economics and psychology. So, if I'm teaching on externalities in economics, it's very easy for me to make that climate connection. If I'm talking about the impacts of the climate crisis on mental health, obviously in my psychology class, there's a lot of, connections to be made. But we also do want it to be in the standards to ensure that it is spread out throughout all grade levels, interdisciplinary, that it's not being skipped over, that you don't miss 2 days of school and miss what's happening in our world. And one of the things that teachers hate to hear in professional development is we're not asking you to do anything you're not already doing. And then they ask you to do something that you're not already doing. And so as a former educator, my approach to that is I am asking you to do something that you're not already doing. And it's one of the most important things that you could do for your students based on their concerns and their development and understanding of the climate crisis. And I think we need to have a look at our standards. There's some. I also used to teach government. There's a standard on the Compromise of 1877, and with the presidential election. It's I would take the climate crisis over that. We can, if we solve the climate crisis in 50 years, we can put it back in, but we should have a look at our standards and make sure that throughout all subjects and grade levels, we are providing this critical education to our young people.
I sense when you talk, there's a real urgency in your voice, and I think all of you are part of this organization. Is it a fact that maybe we need to revamp the curriculum? I think Dan and I would always argue that digital learning and digital literacy should be, very much not a sidebar thing, but embedded into day-to-day students' learning. Why are we not doing it? What do you think as governments or institutions? Is it that it's being done, but it's not amplified enough that everybody realizes it, or is it just piecemeal? Bryce?
Well, it's really difficult to change standards. That's and I guess I'm coming at this a little bit right now from a United States perspective, but we're in a federal system similar to Canada and Germany, in which these decisions need to be made at the state or province level, and they're very political. We have climate deniers. We have people who, we have states that are putting standards in, recommendations that talk about the benefits of fossil fuels. So we have people going in the opposite direction, providing information that is climate denying essentially. And it's hard to get it in all the subjects. I agree with what you were saying with computer literacy. That's one of the examples we use as well, where when I was in school, I would go to my computer class and I would learn about computers, and then I would go to every other class and never talk about computers or think about technology in that context, where we don't want that. We want climate education to be embedded in all subjects, so that we're learning about it from different angles and we have a comprehensive understanding. And then also one of the advantages of that interdisciplinary approach is, right now with having climate education so focused in the sciences, is that, students have different strengths. And so the students who feel strongest in the sciences right now, they might view the climate crisis as their fight, their issue to get involved in. And, as a former humanities student, I might have felt like, well, that's not really my thing. I can't really contribute. And, we need the students who are strongest in English or in art thinking about, okay, how can I contribute to this?
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting how often this topic falls into the sciences. But what's interesting, and I think Dan would agree with me, international schools are very different. We don't have federal governments yet, we use the International Baccalaureate, and there's much more agility. But I'm wondering, I don't know, Dan, from your experience, you work with a lot of schools. How often do you hear the topic climate change?
It comes up a lot. I think there's, I think a lot of it's extracurricular. I know my kids' international school, they have some kind of climate. I don't know if it's a society or some meetings and things. It happens quite a bit. But I think, as John, that the reality is especially with international baccalaureate, like the kids are under so much pressure to get through the subjects they already are. And like you said, digital citizenship, I don't think it isn't enough. I would argue that maths and science isn't taught anywhere near enough in schools, especially in Europe. And so I guess, the climate issue comes up against the same problem of just what are the hours in the day? I'm sure getting more extracurricular things could be one of the answers to it.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I think, as you say, there are a lot of schools that do roots and shoots and the eco club and things like that. And it's interesting how sometimes that is the easier space to engage, but then you just get a group of kids that are interested, and the kids, like Bryce's point, with the humanities and the science. Then you get a group of kids that actually are never dealing with it. I'm just mindful of time. I think what we'd like as we wrap up is one thing, for an educator or a school leader, and you can pick whoever you want. What would you say is something to think about here? We're at the beginning of a new academic year. The reality is climate change is far more prominent. Every day you open the newspaper, you hear something. In Switzerland, our glaciers are going. I mean, it's not like, the next 10, 20 years, you can, and I'm exaggerating 100%, you can almost watch them melt. That's how accelerated the situation has become. And so I'm just wondering if you had to guide or give some advice to an educator or a leader, what might that be through the lens of what you're doing? So maybe I can start with Dennis, Emily, and then over to Bryce. Dennis.
Yeah, I think one of the things to consider, and maybe this is from my own experience, but I always focused on careers. And, students are in school, obviously, to learn, but one of the things is preparing for a job. And I think as an educator, it's important to know that green jobs, it's booming. I mean, every year, billions of dollars are invested into the green economy. And I think, one thing that as an educator you should learn is that every single job will have some aspect of green skills in it. Even just with the example that my coworker gave, so he's our website manager at Earth Day, he said a green skill is as simple as creating your website so that it is in dark mode because it takes up less energy. So even small things like that can be considered green skills. So I think kind of thinking a little bit long term as an educator, you're preparing your students for, a job in the future, and every single job will have green skills embedded in them.
Interesting. Emily, thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, kind of the opposite of Dennis. Instead of looking kind of towards the future, the now, being a former elementary school teacher, I think about the smaller children that we teach, the small learners. And I think they're never too young to hear about climate change. I think it's how we frame it and how we talk about it. So I think having conversations that are developmentally appropriate are critical here. And whether that's a read aloud that talks about renewable energy or, starting a garden. I think the conversation needs to start as soon as possible. And there's ways to do that and slowly integrate it, even with our youngest learners.
Excellent. Bryce.
I would just like to, help teachers build their efficacy for teaching climate education. The top two reasons that teachers are not teaching climate education is because, one, they believe it doesn't align with their subject. And I think, in a quick conversation or looking at some of our materials or maybe the World Bank materials, you can see it does align with your subject area. And the other is a lack of training or understanding. And, you don't have to, especially if you're a humanities teacher, you don't need to understand all of the science to start a conversation with your students about this, because you're coming at it from your area of expertise. You're bringing in something you might not know everything about, but that's okay. And your students they're already thinking about this. They already know a lot about it. They're already very concerned. It's not okay to just ignore it. So engage with them. And you might find that some of that knowledge that you don't have, that a lot of your students might have. So I would just encourage teachers to, even if it's just one lesson, this fall, incorporate climate in a way you haven't before and see how it goes and maybe build off that.
Thank you. And I really do want to encourage our audience to go to the show notes because you've put so much in there and you can see their videos and resources. And you also have this, and Dennis, remind me again, it's the climate guide, the thing that, what's the title?
It's the School's Guide to Climate Education.
Excellent. And so this is a guide that you can go to, and you can also integrate that as more weaving into current standards and benchmarks and curriculum. And then also, Bryce, you mentioned the World Bank report, which I assume is available online for free.
Yeah, it was just released last week, and it discusses both the effects of the climate crisis on education, but also how climate education is so critical for addressing the climate crisis. It's 150 some pages, and it has a ton of data to support all the claims. So it's a great report.
Good. Thank you. Well, all three of you, thank you so much. I know you're all calling from very far away, so it's very likely early in the morning, but we so appreciate you coming on the International Schools Podcast. And I'd just like to remind our audience show notes. And also, we want to thank our LinkedIn page has just exploded. Where this summer, more and more people joined us, and that's where we're sharing things out. And of course, if you feel so inclined, go to the Apple Podcast or Spotify and give us a rating, because that allows us, as we get better ratings, we can reach out to more prominent and interesting people. Sometimes we try to reach out to people and they don't really want to talk to us, but we're always so appreciative. And this is an example. Our Earth Day reached out to us. They said they were listening to the podcast. One of the colleagues of Dennis, Bryce, and Emily, and we were so excited, and they suggested we engage, so we did, and we so appreciate that reach out. Thank you so much. Dan, any closing thoughts? Or as you go onto your bicycle?
My what, sorry?
Yeah. As you know, you drive an electric car, so you're already halfway there.
Yeah, I do, but there's different studies. I'm not sure how good that is in the end. I'm very confused about that one. I think it's fascinating. Just one small thing in closing. Like, I often wonder why the climate organizations, yourself including other people, don't like, because I think the thing is, obviously climate science is very complex, and I think like Bryce, you mentioned about in the US, there's a lot of people who deny climate change, and everywhere in the world, but I guess we hear about the US the most. But I think one of the things that kind of emboldens that attitude is like, for example, somebody will say, if we don't do this, then sea level will rise by this many centimeters in X years, and then it doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean it hasn't risen. It just means like climate science is so hard to predict, like exactly, and I often wonder why people don't just say, we shouldn't trash the planet because it's the right thing to do. Do you want landfills? Do you want noxious fumes? Like, let's imagine that climate change didn't exist. Like, it would still be the right thing to do all these things. I wonder if that's something, a message people also do, or does that kind of come up at all? And do you agree with it?
I think that's a great point, and that is something that at Earth Day we are looking at, is how can we engage everyone, because this is a global movement, and everyone wants to protect the planet for their different reasons. And I do agree that, a lot of environmental orgs tend to approach it from maybe the climate science, but, we've got a lot of people who are, love the outdoors, love fishing, and, we need to protect those environments. So definitely at Earth Day, we want to, engage all people, kind of whatever their motivation is, whatever their passion is, think about how, they can engage in Earth Day or a theme to protect that passion.
Definitely. And I think John and me can share it out to schools we work with and stuff. And I'll definitely, pass it on to my networks for them to get involved as well. So thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Dennis, Bryce, and Emily. Thank you so much. And I want to remind our audience, earthday.org. Definitely spend some time on their website and the amazing resources. And I want to thank Dennis, Bryce, and Emily also for the links and the guides and the videos that they put in the show notes. And we look forward to the focus is on power this year, right, Bryce?
Yeah.
So
focus on renewables.
Focus on renewables. So we'll hopefully amplify that in our own networks. And if you're listening, please do think about how you can do a small little change. And as I think Dennis and Emily were saying, it's about making those connections locally, something that's happening in the environment that the kids can actually feel and see. Really seems, as both your anecdotes seem so powerful. So thank you very much. And thank you for listening to the International Schools Podcast.